I was scraping burnt bits from a frying pan with the edge of a plastic spatula, thinking about the rent due Friday and whether the child support would land on time, when the lights over the sink flickered as if the building took a breath and then held it, and a single siren far off cut through the cool September morning like a thread pulled tight. I glanced at the clock on the microwave, but it was blank, and then my phone, face down on the counter next to the lunch I'd packed for my daughter, buzzed itself along the laminate like a trapped beetle. Municipal alert, the lock screen said, in the same font I'd seen a dozen times for weather warnings and boil advisories from the plant. The message was short, like whoever typed it was told to keep it simple: shelter in place. Report violent behavior. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. That was it. No cause, no duration. The coffee maker clicked off mid-drip, the fridge went quiet, and the apartment felt suddenly too large, too hollow. The fifth-floor windows pulling in that late summer chill and the smell of somebody's cigarette in the courtyard. I took a breath, and when I looked at the photo magnet on the fridge, Emma with ketchup on her chin last month at the fair, I knew the morning had pivoted. I moved. I turned the gas off at the stove, tucked the knife block under the sink where a kid's curious hand wouldn't find it by habit, slid the deadbolt, checked the peephole, and called my daughter's name. She was in the bedroom we shared since her mother moved to Cincinnati in April, still in pajamas, her hair in a tangle, trying to drag her backpack across the bed by one strap. She saw my face and stopped pulling. "School?" she asked. "No," I said. I told her to get her shoes on and grab her hoodie, which was the yellow one she hated, but at least I could spot it, and I told her to stick close. When she asked why, I told the truth I had at hand. The city sent an alert and we were going to be careful until we knew more. She watched me clear the little table of bills and grocery circulars and set out what I could carry without showing I was doing it out of fear. I was a maintenance tech at the North Fork water treatment plant, and care and weight lived in my wrists. I took the small flashlight from the junk drawer, shook it. The beam was clean and the battery icon I'd scratched onto the side in Sharpie said the cells were fresh as of August. I added a box cutter, a roll of electrical tape, the good adjustable wrench I kept for when the super ignored our leaky sink, and a half roll of heavy trash bags. I put the first aid kit on top, counted the contents out loud to keep my voice steady: gauze, tape, 3 wrapped pads, a tiny bottle of iodine, 2 foil packets of Tylenol, 1 of aspirin, and slid it back in. I had the little Ruger .22 I kept locked in a steel box in the closet because my father had done the same, but I hated that I had it at all, and the magazine was a habit more than an intent. 10 rounds. Subsonic. I checked it anyway and tucked it into the small of my back with an old leather belt that cut my hips when I bent, the belt I'd promised myself to replace before winter. I felt my knee twinge as I squatted to get the bottled water from under the bed, 3 quarts, cheap brand. I added 2 granola bars and a pair of bananas, soft at the stem. I told Emma to carry the light backpack with a sweater, water, and the whistle she'd gotten from a summer camp counselor, and to keep the whistle for me, not for her. By the time I had us ready, the building had woken to the same notion. The couple down the hall were talking low and fast, and the baby next door cried with the high, catching breath of a child who'd woken into the wrong kind of day. I cracked the door and watched the hallway, turquoise pink scuffed waist high, 1 emergency light blinking every 3 seconds. I waited 3 blinks and no one ran past, no one screamed, so we moved. I kept my body between my girl and the end of the hall that looked over the stairwell. I grew up learning to make little maps out of habit, where the doors open and the corners invite or trap, where the noise you make becomes a shape that lives in the space. 5th floor to 4th, a draft smelling of old cardboard. 4th to 3rd, someone said hey, 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 behind a door, not like a cry for help, more like a phrase repeating itself for comfort, and I heard Emma glide her shoes against the concrete and reminded her to lift, lift, lift. On the 2nd floor landing we heard it for the first time, a sound like hands slapping a wall, not hitting like a fight, but tapping, same interval, steady, like a metronome. It came from somewhere below us in the stairwell, and I felt my spine try to go to water. The air was colder in the stairwell than it should have been, and my breath fogged. Outside was a gray sky and a wind stubborn from the north, so not yet winter, but the kind of day that stiffens joints. I motioned her back up a step, raised a finger to my lips, and listened. Tap, 2-3, tap, 2-3. We waited through 6 taps. And then, as if some internal clock shifted a gear, the pattern doubled speed. Tap, 1, tap, 1. I pictured hands raw from the concrete. I pictured blood and stopped the pictures like a man shutting a valve. We took the long way, down the back stairs that serve the laundry room, which are narrower, but have a door that opens onto the courtyard, and from there we could walk along the fence to the parking lot where my car sat under the same dead maple it had sat under for 3 years. The courtyard had 3 people in it: the older woman who feeds the stray cat under the dumpster, a man in a suit I didn't recognize, Tyascu, and a kid from the 2nd floor with an arm in a sling from a scooter fall last week. They all looked at my daughter first. I put my arm out and said we were heading to the car and then to my work, because the plant had backup generators and it was as good a plan as any I'd ever made in a hurry. The woman who feeds the cat said the buses were down and her grandson hadn't texted back. The man in the suit held up his palms and said, "You hear that?" And the tap 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 came again, from inside the building now, echo up the cinder block like a drill sergeant. Tap, 2-3, tap, 2-3. The boy with the sling started to hum to himself, a tune I didn't know, steady and under his breath, and his hum was a relief against the tapping because it wasn't a pattern that matched it. "Come on," I told Emma, and we moved along the fence, through the aluminum gate that catches your hand if you let it swing, and across the lot. The car was a 2008 Corolla that had outlived 3 owners because it was plain and reliable and had an engine that forgave neglect. I keep a plastic milk crate in the trunk with road flares, a rusted set of sockets, a ratty blanket for picnics or breakdowns, and a gallon of distilled water I buy from work at cost. I added the crate to the back seat where Emma sat, and I told her about the seat belt twice. The key turned without protest. I watched the dashboard lights flare and then settle with a steadiness that felt like proof that some things hold. I breathed in the smell of old coffee and my daughter's bubblegum shampoo and told myself to move like the day wanted, not like I wanted. We live on the west side of town, a strip of low apartment blocks, taco stands, tire shops, and the old mill buildings converted into storage units and small gyms. The city had that empty city Sunday feeling even though it was Tuesday. A police car idled at the far end of the block, doors open, no one in sight. A woman at the bus stop had one heel in the gutter and a hand on the glass, staring toward downtown. The dog park was empty. On the long straight that follows the river, I could see smoke from somewhere past the rail yard, a smear of black like a grease mark on the horizon. The radio gave me one station telling me to hold on for a special message that never came. I kept my eyes on the intersections and my hands at 10 and 2 like a novice driver because there's a way to dial fear down by doing the small things right. Emma kept her backpack on her lap like a shield. She watched the sidewalks, and twice she said, "Daddy," in that way that means she wants to point but was taught not to point, and twice I told her I saw, though the second time I didn't, and later I wished I had. The North Fork plant sits beyond the big box strip, past the Costco and the chain restaurant that looks like a barn, past the self-storage place with the orange doors that go dark when movement stops. I knew the plant's systems as well as I knew the scars on my knuckles. The generators could run for a week if we were careful, and there were filters and chlorine supply and enough treatment capacity to keep the taps on for the hospital if the river behaved. There was also a fence and a gate I could control, and I had the keys in the same ring as the apartment and the car and the locker at work where I kept an extra pair of socks for when my boots filled with rain. That was my thinking. We would shelter where I understood the buttons. We hit our first real obstacle at the parking garage next to the county building. The traffic lights blinked red and the lanes merged themselves into a tangle as 2 cars stalled nose to nose, their drivers out and shouting, their shouts oddly disciplined, short bursts, like 2 men arguing over a bag of concrete. I took the side street to sneak around them and then met a cluster of people coming out the garage stairwell, 4 or 5, moving fast but not in a straight line, like they got the general idea of fleeing and were improvising the rest. One man, a heavy-set guy in a sports hoodie, face gray with sweat, ran dead into the side of a moving SUV and bounced like a dropped ham, then stood up and started hammering at the nearest thing he could hit, which happened to be a concrete pillar. His hands were already raw. He hit the pillar with the same rhythm I'd heard in the stairwell. Tap, 2-3, tap, 2-3, and then he turned toward the nearest person like he heard an answer. I didn't think. I pulled into the garage entrance half a car length, killed the engine, told Emma to hold the belt and not move, and stepped out with the wrench in my right hand and the box cutter in my left pocket, not with any plan to be a hero, just to move an obstacle before it rolled over us later. The air in the garage was 10 degrees cooler, smelling of damp concrete and old exhaust. The echoes made sound a liar, one voice becoming several, one tap fracturing into a chorus. I made myself a short map, the stairwell on the left, 3 cars parked haphazard across the exit lane, a dropped orange cone under a bumper, a fire hose cabinet with the glass intact, the main ramp up to the right leading toward the open sky and the river light. The heavy man had found his way to a woman backed against a pillar, her back flat, hands up. He was doing that thing they do in bad fights, ham-fist punches at shoulder height, as if the shoulder were the enemy, and the woman had a magazine in one hand like she meant to swat a fly and was losing her nerve. I don't know why I stepped in. Maybe because her nails were clean and I recognized that as something my kid would notice and be afraid of later if I did not. I got behind him, not close enough to grab, but close enough to tap his shoulder with the wrench like a teacher with a ruler, light, 3 times. He turned and he came at me, exactly like I deserved for asking for his attention. His eyes were not white or red, they were regular human eyes, but his pupils were small like he'd stepped into sunlight. He didn't shout, he hissed between cracked lips like he had a small hole in his throat. He swung the same arm he'd used on the pillar and the woman, and I saw the split skin and the blood pooling in the lines of his palm. I stepped back and he stepped forward and I made my first ugly choice. I swung the wrench at his hand, not at his head, because I was still myself. I felt the bones in his fingers give like twigs. He didn't howl. He didn't jump back. He simply shifted his weight and shuddered like something had reset, and then he cocked his head because my wrench hitting flesh had made a certain pattern sound in that hard space, and I realized something solid that would become Rule 1 in my head. They like patterns. Random noise confused him, but anything with a beat drew him. The echo in that stairwell had been a map for him to follow and a summons. I adjusted my grip on the wrench so it wouldn't ring when I swung again. I changed how I breathed. I kept my feet light so my steps didn't hit the same spots. When he came again, I went low and hit him in the knee, hard, the same way my own knee tells me about old ladders and cold mornings. He fell awkwardly against the pillar, and his head struck the edge of the concrete. He didn't bounce. He crumpled. He kept moving his hands, though, palms exploring the ground like he was trying to learn it. I didn't wait to see if he would stand. I looked for the woman and she was already gone, sneakers slapping a brisk rhythm that sent 2 other figures moving toward her route like iron filings to a magnet. "Emma," I said, before I remembered myself, and I saw my daughter's face through the windshield, pale, eyes huge. I put 2 fingers up and pointed to her seatbelt and then to my chest and then to the steering wheel to pantomime that I was coming back, and she nodded, which meant she was counting too. I ran to the SUV the heavy man had bounced off, the door hung open, keys still in. I hit the button to set off the car alarm, then hit it again, and it blared, 1 note, then stopped, 1 note, then stopped, irregular, and I watched 3 of them, men in office clothes. A teenager with a skateboard yelled wrong, turn toward the sound, hesitate, and then break off like they had lost the scent. I filed it under the same column in my head. Patterns woke them. Irregularities dulled them. Tapping drew them like dinner bells. I made a note deep in myself to stop the habits that kept me alive in normal days, counting steps, humming the chorus of whatever song my brain fished up. I would not become a metronome. We made it to the plant using the service road behind the big box stores. The Costco had its roll-up doors half down, a forklift sat tilted with its forks buried in a pallet of bottled water, and a man with a shaved head yelled at another man who held his hands out as if weight alone could explain guilt. The larger stores all have back corridors, concrete and cinder block, with wide fire doors that can be propped with a brick. I thought about stopping for batteries and tents and the other things one collects and lists when the world gives you a show about how quickly it can unspool. But I had my daughter in the back seat, watching my eyes in the rear view like a small judge. We kept going. I kept close to the buildings to avoid the wider streets where the groups already formed. A woman pushed a shopping cart not with goods but with a baby who was old enough to balance sitting up and too young to understand the world had shifted, and the sight of the baby made my chest ache. But a man with a vest marked loss prevention had set himself like a goalie between the cart and the store, and that looked to me like the kind of wrestling match that creates patterns of sound, and I wanted nothing to do with it. At the plant, the gate stood half closed, the chain looped but not locked. I had the keys. I did not need to make a show of using them. I bent and slid my hand under the chain like a man unlocking a dog run and eased the gate open just enough to admit the Corolla. The hum I felt in my feet told me the generators were running. Somebody had done their job. I parked alongside the south wall where the wind didn't bite as hard and got Emma inside before anything on the road could take interest in the motion. Inside the admin building, the air smelled like paper and coffee that had burned too long on a hot plate. The outage had tripped half the exit signs. The control room still had 2 screens alive, showing green bars and the steady heartbeat of the chlorine feed. I found Mason in the lounge, knees up, hands around a styrofoam cup, his face blank like he'd used up all his expressions. He was 60 and had stayed at this plant since before I learned to read. He had a way of telling stories about valves that made you respect the metal. He looked at Emma and his eyes sharpened. "You shouldn't have brought her," he said, and then he shook his head like the words had come out without permission. "No. That's wrong. I'm glad you made it. There's a cot in the lab." I thanked him. I asked who else was here. He said Carlos had gone to check on his mother and didn't come back. Raina was up in the intake shed, watching the river for anything that didn't look like water. The city had called to tell us we were to maintain output for hospitals in certain neighborhoods listed in a document that printed itself halfway and then jammed when the power surged. Mason and I both knew which neighborhoods would be on that list even if we didn't see the rest of the page. We were to let the North Fork keep its mouth open even if the rest of the body was choking. It was the kind of order that feels right until you put your hands on a valve and remember pressure has opinions. I settled Emma in the lab with the cot and a chair pulled up to make a little wall. I gave her a bottle of water and a granola bar and the paperback she'd been pretending not to like because the main character is a boy. I told her to use the bathroom now while the flush still worked and to shout only if it was necessary. She asked me what necessary meant and I said she'd know when it was that feeling that made your stomach fold. I put a sticky note on the lab window for my own brain: "Do not knock. They like patterns." I wrote it like a joke so my hand would make the letters steady. The river ran high from a week of rain. The intake shed has a narrow catwalk and the smell of algae and wet wood. Raina stood at the top of the ladder watching the surface for bodies or logs. She had her long hair braided and tucked into the back of her cap. She had her father's old shotgun leaned against the wall, the barrel oiled and matte, 8 shells on a rubber loop around the stock. She nodded when she saw me. "It's worse downtown," she said, like I hadn't driven through it. "The plant can run a week if we don't get greedy. The chlorine feed is stuck high. I can't figure it because the sensor says normal, but I can smell it in my teeth." I told her I'd look at the flow restrictor. She added, "They came to the fence. 5 of them. They didn't climb. They touched it and tapped it and then moved along like they were listening through their skin." She knocked her knuckles on the rail, 1, 2, 3, and something behind me responded. A tapping on the underside of the catwalk, hollow, not human bone, more like boot heel. We both froze, breath in our throats. She gave me a look and I nodded. She did not knock again. I went to the chlorine room with the wrench in the mask, the one with the cartridge that makes the world smell like a tire shop. The feed was, as she said, stuck high. I closed the valve halfway and counted, slow, letting the needle settle. I thought about the way chlorine takes smell away in high concentrations because it destroys your nose's sensors and you can drown in it because you cannot smell yourself dying. I adjusted until the needle did what it should. I made a note on the panel with a grease pencil: "Valve sticky. Later clean." As I wrote it, my hand made a soft repetitive squeak and I stopped and stared at the doorway until my heart rate dropped under the threshold where you can hear your own pulse. I was teaching myself new habits every minute. By late afternoon we'd settled into a rhythm. I hate the word now, but then it meant the shape of things that felt like a plan. Mason took the control room and phoned the hospital to say we were fine for now. Raina watched the river and the fence. I did laps of the property and checked the generator fuel. We ate beef jerky from the vending machine and stale coffee we heated on a small lab burner. I rationed Emma's snacks with the kind of meanness that reads as love if you aren't the age where sugar is a right. I counted the bullets in the Ruger twice and put it back in my belt and told myself that it was better in my belt than in my hand, because I knew how I shook when I had a gun in my hand and I didn't want to shake in front of my kid. I made the first test of the new rule at dusk. The fence had a spot near the south gate where the wind made a loose sign tap the metal, and I saw 3 of them on the other side of the road pause and turn toward the sound, then begin to walk in a weird congruence, hips forward, heads tilted, like they were following a swing of a pendulum only they could see. I took the long pole we used to hook tool lines and leaned out from the corner of the building where they couldn't see me and banged it against the ground twice, long, then short, then a scatter of taps with no pattern. They hesitated. One of them, an older woman in a nightgown and slippers, hair wet like she had left the shower to answer a door, took 2 steps toward me when I did the long taps and then veered away when I scattered the sound. I did it 3 times more, irregular each time. It worked. If I kept the noise random, they did not converge. If I fell into a beat, even a clumsy one, they turned and came. I filed Rule 1 in my head like the first sentence of a manual I wished I did not need to write. They respond to patterns. We must not be a drone. The second rule came by accident. Emma had to pee in the night and was frightened of the dark bathroom down the lab hall. I took her, holding her elbow. In the hallway, the chlorine smell from the feed room drifted strong, sharper than it should have been after my fixes, like the wind had shifted in the ducts. At the same time, I heard soft, shuffling feet beyond the back door that opens onto the chemical delivery ramp. That door has a round window at eye level, and like a fool I went to it, and my face was inches from another face, a man's, flat and pale and smeared with something dark around the mouth like he'd eaten cherries and fallen asleep with the juice on his skin. He saw me or felt me and his hand came up to the glass and tapped, tap, 2-3, tap, 2-3. My body went electric with the urge to run, but I made myself breathe and then I realized the chlorine smell surged with each breeze from the vent, and when it did, his tapping faltered, like a radio station losing signal, and his head cocked and his mouth worked. I opened the small vent above the door and let the chlorinated air out in a steady stream. The man outside flinched, not back, but inward, like a cat whose whiskers have found a live wire. He made a whining sound, barely a sound, more pressure in his throat, and he stepped to the side and lost interest. I shut the vent and the chlorine smell lessened, and he came back and tapped again in his patient rhythm. I repeated the vent move, and again he faltered. I woke Mason and told him I thought the strong chemical smell, maybe chlorine or ammonia, confused them or masked what they followed, and we tested it stupidly by spraying a bottle of diluted bleach we used for lab surfaces onto the threshold and then waiting. He came to the line of smell and then walked along it like a blind man feeling for a curb. He did not cross it. When the smell dissipated, he did. That became Rule 2, strong chlorine or ammonia broke their focus. We decided smell wasn't exactly the right word, but it was the word we had, so we used it. We called it smell and did not get precious. Later, Rule 2 kept us alive. By morning the world knew. The radio had found a voice. It gave us an emergency loop in a woman's steady, kind tone that told us to stay inside, avoid groups, and report any clusters to the police, who would handle it. It sounded like the message you get when you call a hospital at night. It made me furious for no reason beyond the fact that it was the wrong tone for a day when the sky over the rail yard had a second black smear and the wind had a new taste. I told Emma we would not be heroes and also we would not curl up and wait for the roof to cave in. She said okay, and I knew she was borrowing my words and I better live up to them or she'd carry the cracks for years. Around noon of the second day, a group came to the gate and waved a white towel in the air. They were not the tapping kind. They moved like tired people. They kept their voices low and irregular, which was a good sign. There were 3 men and 2 women and a boy about 14 with a bicycle and a cargo rack with a 5-gallon bucket tied to it. One man wore a transit vest. He introduced himself as Brandon. They were from the transit depot 2 miles east. The buses had all come in at once when the power first dropped. Someone had the sense to barricade the doors with benches and park 2 buses sideways to block the lot entrance. They had food from vending machines and the little cafeteria, and they had an ice machine that lasted a day. They had made up rules fast and not out of meanness but out of survival. They used colored armbands to mark roles. Blue for runners who went out for specific needs. Green for kitchen and cleaning. Yellow for med red meant you had been scratched or bit and you were in observation, which they did behind a chain link fence, and they sang old bus driver hymns at certain hours to keep the sound in the depot irregular. They wanted water. They were rationing bottled water and were down to a gallon a day for 15 people. They had a set of whistle codes for emergencies, 2 short whistles for gate, 3 for breach, but they'd learned the hard way that holding the whistles in any pattern invited a crowd, so they had spread them out, teaching each person to blow wild, to let panic be unmetered. They offered a trade, diesel from their emergency tanks for our help setting up a draw from the outdoor spigot to their drums, and maybe, if we had it, chlorine tabs we used for the lab wash stations. They had 2 kids at the depot, both older than Emma but young enough for voices to catch in their throats at night. Brandon said they didn't take kids on runs. They were strict about that. They didn't take people prone to panic on runs either, and they had a board where they wrote names and assignments, and they held votes on some matters and not others, and they had 3 rules written on a piece of cardboard: no patterns, no solos, no saints. The last rule sounded ugly until I understood it. Don't offer more than you can sustain, because tomorrow you'll be asked again and you'll have nothing, so better to be fair from the start than a false hope. We made the trade. We rigged a siphon to fill drums they pulled on the bicycle cargo rack 2 at a time with a second bike as a pusher, and the irregular clatter of the chain kept the watchers beyond the fence disinterested. I gave them a box of chlorine tabs with a warning not to mix them with cleaners and not to store them near acids, and they looked at me like I had handed them gold. In return, they gave us 2 red plastic fuel cans of diesel for the generators and 1 for a vehicle. I didn't tell them my car ran on gas, not diesel. I could trade it later. Brandon asked if we wanted to come to the depot. He said they had rules and a system and a place for kids to sleep. He said the plant was good, but it could become a target because glows and hums attract attention, and because any place that gives water is a place that creates traffic, and traffic creates patterns, and patterns call the tapping kind like drumlines call dancers. I told him I would think, which meant I needed to watch one more day and see if the river held and the fence held and my nerve held. On the 3rd day the food became the thing. Emma had 2 granola bars left from the pack, and the vending machine had been emptied of anything sweet by whomever had the same idea before me. There were cans of chili in the locker room emergency kit, 6 of them, dusty, dented but not on the seams, and saltine crackers that tasted like old cardboard even on the first bite. We ate a can between the 3 of us, heated over the lab burner, and called it lunch, and then the slow grind of hunger arrived like a tax bill. I have lived on rice and peanut butter. I know the rhythm of cheap meals. This was different. This was the knowledge that whatever we ate today made tomorrow that much smaller. Mason had a bag of hard candies in his desk he kept to suck on to stop smoking. He put it on the table and said, "For the kids," and Emma took one, grape, and put the rest back, and he looked at her like she had done a magic trick, and I wanted to hug the old man and tell him he was still part of the good world. That afternoon, Raina did a run to the big box store on her own because she said she moved faster solo. She said it like a dare. I argued. I told her about the rule at the depot, no solos, and she laughed and said rules are for groups. She had the shotgun on her shoulder and a duffel bag and a pair of bolt cutters. She said she'd go through the back corridor, those wide concrete hallways where they move pallets and lock up the expensive small things. She knew where the batteries lived because she had a flashlight in her glove compartment that had died 10 times under that particular ceiling. This is how we learn a city. She would be fast. She would avoid patterns. She would be back before dark. I watched her cross the lot and slip along the side of the building where the dumpsters are, and the smell there was a deep sweet rot that attracted flies even in the cool air. The door was propped with a broken broom handle. She slid through without letting the door clap. I went back to my daughter and Mason and we waited. She was gone longer than she said she would be. When she returned, it was at a run, not a sprint, but the long distance, end-of-race pace of a person who has already burned through the panic and is running on the steady drum of breath and muscle memory. Her duffel bounced against her thigh. She had a line of blood on her forearm that looked like she'd brushed a nail. She blew through the gate and dropped the duffel on the concrete and leaned one hand on her knee and spit. They use the back corridors like deer paths now, she said, and then she laughed once, a bark I didn't like. She said she'd made it to the battery aisle through the back, moving with that irregular, no rhythm step, counting without counting, and she'd filled the bag with batteries and a pack of headlamps and 2 handheld radios, and then a car alarm had gone off somewhere on the floor above her, one of those old alarms that cycles through different modes, steady beep, long blare, chirp, and she watched 3 of them walk toward the garage ramp like a tide following the moon, calm, certain. She waited until they were past, and then she had set a trap not by design but because bad luck makes plans on your behalf. She had leaned a rolling cage against a fire door to block the echo down the corridor, and when she moved past it, her boots scuffed the floor in the same interval twice, and the three she had watched go up toward the garage turned back. Not all the way, just a half turn and then a drift, slow, like you tap a fish tank and the fish decide it matters. She said she found a way to knock a mop bucket against the metal side of a cage in a random run and then drop it, and that worked. They paused, murmured, hands on the wall. She slipped by. She had almost made it to the door when someone, human, called out in a whisper, "Hey," and she had the sense to pretend to drop something and make a whole mess of irregular sound, and the person who had called "Hey" got a visitor instead of her. She did not look back. She broke Rule 3, no saints, because she did not go help a whispering stranger. She dumped the duffel in my hands and said, "Split this by thirds. I owe someone a prayer I don't believe in." That night the transit depot sent a runner. Her name was Shonda. She wore a blue armband and carried a clipboard, which made me like her because it meant someone was keeping track, and she had a whistle on a cord, which she wore under her shirt. She said the depot had been good, mostly, but a man had tried to take more food than the bracelet allowed and a fight had broken out, and the fight had created a rhythm, and 5 had gathered at the loading dock and tapped at the steel door until the hinges sang back. They needed help reinforcing the dock, and they had an idea that came from a gardener who lived across the street from the depot, a community garden that had chain-link sound curtains, strips of tin cans and plastic bottles that clinked in the wind to keep birds off the tomatoes. The gardener said they could string such curtains in the depot, but randomly, not in neat lines, and the clatter might confuse the watchers long enough to move supplies. They needed hands and wire cutters and someone who understood weight and swing and the way sound breathes in a big space. She looked at me when she said that. I knew she knew I was a plant tech because I'd said it yesterday like a man advertising his usefulness. When your worth is your work, you say it too often. I told Mason we could help. I told Emma she would stay with him, and she started to cry without making any sound, just a face that closed, and I found a way to say that helping them made them more likely to help us later when we needed it, and the way her mouth softened told me that part of her believed and part did not. I took the new headlamp out of the package and put it on and told myself to leave it off unless absolutely necessary because batteries are like daylight, you spend them and the darkness notices. The depot sat on a generous corner with wide sidewalks and an overhang where smokers once stood to gossip. They had placed benches and bicycle racks and 2 buses in a way that made a funnel, and that funnel was meant to create and hold irregular sound. They had painted lines on the ground with parking lot paint, not for neatness but to remind people to stagger, to break lines, to move like water. Inside, the ceiling was high and the walls had maps of routes with colored lines like veins. There were 30 people, including 2 kids and 1 elderly man who seemed like furniture until he spoke, and then you saw how the group arranged itself around his words. The red band area was a pen with chain link, tarps for privacy, and a tall fan right outside it that was pointed away from the sleepers so the smell went away from the room, not toward it. The person inside the pen sat on a cot and traced a pattern on the blanket with 1 finger. The group had rules posted large near the entrance: no patterns, no solos, no saints. A smaller sign said, "Taps draw them. Sing wrong. Step wrong. Live." It was almost funny, except it was not. I worked with Shonda and 2 others to hang the sound curtains the gardener had made, rows of cans and plastic lids and keys on string. We did not hang them in lines. We hung them so they broke echoes into pieces. We cut thin wire and twisted it with pliers, and my fingers remembered the feel of safety wire from the plant. I found a place near the loading dock where the metal door rang like a bell when anyone touched it, and I convinced them to hang a thick rubber mat there to kill the resonance. We tested it by having Shonda slap the door while I stood outside on the dock and listened. The slap now sounded like a hand on a pillow. We called that a win. We called it a small quiet spot in a loud world. The community had armbands and whistles and a way to make stew out of nothing. They had a counting system for cans and a written record of who took what when. They had a quiet hours rule that was not silent because silence has a rhythm too if you hold it too long. They had someone practice a hum in irregular measures to cover the coughs of the red band area. I admired them and ached for them both. On the 5th day, the breach came. It was not dramatic at first. A delivery truck had blocked the alley behind the depot, and 2 men from the group went to shift it to free the path for the water drums we'd planned to refill. They were not solo, they were together, but they had been arguing quietly about whether to siphon from the truck for the generators, and their voices had fallen into a pace. They had thumped the truck's head twice each without knowing it as they cursed the cap, and the metal made that same kind of note that turns concrete into a drumhead. 3 watchers appeared in the alley, then 5, then 2 more who might have been curious or might have just been near. The men froze and tried to be smoke. The watchers tapped back, on the brick, on the truck, and then something shifted, like one decided this game had a next step, and the watching became reaching. We moved as we had practiced. The whistles blew, not in unison, not in multiples of anything, but in a scatter like birds startled in different directions. The sound curtains were kicked by 3 men and 1 woman. The dock door stayed quiet. The fans were turned so the air from the cleaning closet, bleached to a mile, blew toward the alley. I grabbed a can of ammonia from the janitor's shelf and splashed it onto the dock's concrete. The first watcher to cross the line of that smell twisted his head and faltered, like he'd walked through a spider web, pulling at an instinct older than the building. I shouted to the men by the truck to drag the rubber mat closer to the alley so the brick could not carry their taps. We made the air hurt in their noses. It bought us seconds. Seconds are money. The kid with the bicycle had an idea that only a kid would have. He ran to the city garden enclosure across the street, cut down a length of the sound curtain with the wire cutters he kept in his cargo pocket like a habit, and rode it back low, dragging the cans behind his back wheel so they clattered in a janky, irregular symphony. The watchers followed the movement and the noise and then lost it because it was not a pattern, and he looped the curtain across the mouth of the alley and we hung it from the truck's mirror and a nail in the brick and from a broom handle jammed in a crack, and then the alley had a mouth full of cans and the watchers had an itch in their minds they could not scratch. We pulled the men behind the truck in, and one had a tear on his forearm like he'd grazed a chain link fence. He did not want the red band. He shouted once, a bad mistake. He apologized. He shouted again when he saw the pen, and the watchers outside all turned their faces at once, and it was like 1,000 movies where the monsters move in one mind, only this time the math lived in my chest. We put him in the pen because rules are for keeping promises you don't want to keep. We gave him a bottle of water and a blanket and a whistle, which he was told to blow only if he had to. I helped hold the tarp while his wife cried into her arm. She wore a green band. She worked in the kitchen, and she already had her hands in bleach water for hours, and she smelled like the chemical cousin of safety. It did not help when the night deepened. We gave her a blue band the next day because she said she wanted to trade places with anyone who needed a rest and the rest needed to keep moving or the edges would close in. This is where I learned their rule 3 again, no saints, because everyone tries to be one for a day and then the next day their hands shake. I made a mistake 2 nights later and paid for it in minutes that will be the last in my head when the final minutes come. I went back to the plant to get more chlorine tabs since we discovered that a light dusting near the dock quell line helped for an hour, and I took Emma because she clung to me and Mason said he'd man the phones and watch the river, and I thought a night drive would be safe because the watchers seemed to slow in the cold. We took the service road past the self-storage place. The motion lights were on timers and came up as we passed, one after the other, each flood throwing our car into relief like a fish briefly lit in a net. Emma said, "They'll see us," and I said, "We're fine," which is what men say when they've already committed to a wrong turn. A man was at the gate to the storage place, pressing the keypad with the palm of his hand over and over, the beeps steady. He was making a pattern without meaning to. I honked, not to be helpful but to break the pattern, and the horn is very much a pattern if you hold it, and in seconds I had 2 shapes step into the road in front of us and one out from behind a delivery truck, and they tapped their hands on my hood without malice, then tapped again, a nest of woodpeckers. I reversed too fast and the Corolla clipped the curb and something in the rear suspension made a noise I did not want to think about then. We made it past, me breathing irregular on purpose like a man trying to win a test of will against his own lungs. At the plant gate I smelled smoke. Mason was not in the control room. The chlorine feed needle was steady but the generator gauge was down a tick. I called his name the careful way, 2 syllables with no rhythm, the way you learn to call a cat who spooks at claps. No answer. The back door was open. The delivery ramp had a smear of blood I pretended was rust. In the lab, the cot was empty and the chair had toppled. There is a quiet that isn't silence but the absence of one particular sound, and I realized I could not hear Mason's old man cough. It is amazing what a person's body counts without telling you. I found him in the intake shed. Raina stood with him. He was breathing, but the breath had that fluttering sound that says the body is deciding. He had gone to check the river and slipped because the catwalk had a slick of moss where the sun never reached, a spot we'd been meaning to scrub, and his shin bone had torn the skin in a long peel. Raina had the shotgun across her chest like a child. She said he fell and the tapping started under the catwalk. She said the tapping started before the blood, and that frightened her worse than anything. She said she had tried to carry him and he had said a sentence, and she had let him finish it instead of lifting that second, and she would hate herself for that until she forgot what hating herself was for. The sentence was, "Tell my brother I never borrowed his rototiller," and we laughed a little because you cannot be human and not laugh when an old man says something ridiculous as if the world were still the world. I cleaned his leg with iodine and taped gauze over it and told Raina to breathe irregular because her breath had become a metronome. She hadn't realized. We watched the river in the orange glow of the emergency light and did not speak. We brought Mason back to the depot because rules or no rules, the plant felt like a mouth about to close. The depot had people and heat and the quiet hours hummed that masked small sounds. He did not get a red band because the wound was a clean cut, not a bite or scrape from a hand. They put him in the corner with a view of the map and gave him hard candy and his face softened into something like sleep. The next day, something ugly and ordinary happened. A man from the outside came to trade and thought he could take more. He was rough in a way that had nothing to do with tapping or humming, just the human rough that comes from missing meals and pride. He pushed a woman. He took a can. He ran when 2 blue bands reached for him. He made a pattern in his steps like a soccer drill. He was striding and planting and breathing in counts of 4 the way a high school coach teaches. The watchers across the street turned as one and came at the depot in a wave so quiet that the silence rang. We slammed the dock door. The rubber mat held. The sound curtains did their busy clatter. The fans blew the ammonia stream across the mouth of the alley. We were holding, and then human nature broke us. The man who had been in the red band pen for 2 days without a bite that broke skin, only a scratch that had not turned nasty, heard his wife cry, and he hit a rhythm on the fence with the whistle they had let him keep for panic. He didn't do it on purpose. He did it because he was a drummer in college and the body knows. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 a simple marching beat, and the watchers turned toward the pen because the brain inside their bodies loved the sound. 2 pushed on the fence in a place the zip ties had not been doubled. The ties snapped with a beautiful ugly line of pops. The pen's door sprang. I heard Shonda yell, not words, just that sound you make when your body moves before language. I shoved the rubber mat against the door again with my shoulder, and my knee shouted loud enough to be its own person. Raina racked the shotgun like a movie and then held it because the noise of that rack would be a perfect pattern and we were learning to unlearn our culture in a week. The man from the pen stumbled out and the watchers reached for him like friends meeting at a train station. He put his hands up like surrender means anything in a language without nouns. I stepped forward with the Ruger drawn and knew it was stupid, but I had a clean line and his face was a face I had hate for because he had just broken the place we were trying to build. I fired once into the head of the closest watcher, and the body dropped, which confirmed what I had suspected but not proven for myself under pressure. A headshot stops them. The others did not howl. They did not retreat. They changed their steps, trying to find the rhythm again. I fired twice more, counting my rounds now in that cold part of my brain I keep for tools and bills. One missed, hitting the doorframe and nicking paint, which gave me a flash of shame at the stupidity of marking a building we were trying to keep unnoticed. The third hit a forehead and the person fell hard. The man from the pen ran toward his wife, and she threw a bucket of diluted bleach at his feet like people throw rice at weddings, anything to make the air change. It slowed the ones behind him. It bought him 3 steps of freedom. He reached her and then made a mistake so human it might as well be a law. He kissed her. He put his hands on each side of her head and kissed her like the first day they got the apartment key and found the light switch. She kissed him back and the depot's rules were broken with kindness, which is the worst way to break anything. We put them both in the pen, which we jerry-rigged back together with zip ties torn in half and reknotted, and I made a note on the map in my head and in small letters in the ledger I kept on a receipt book from the depot office, "Love makes patterns." We could not stay. As Brandon had warned, the water had made us into a checkpoint, and checkpoints create traffic, and traffic makes rhythm. The depot had done everything right, and still the world was elbowing in. A plan had been floating, not spoken to the kids, murmured in corners where adults keep their fear. The plan was to move some of us to the water treatment plant on the east side, which had a different intake, and backed onto the water treatment complex where the chlorine vats were big enough to create a fog if we were truly desperate and stupid. We had a map of the path that used the highway where a jackknifed semi served as a bridge over a fender bender that had turned into a sculpture of stalled cars, and we had a second map that went through the old water treatment plant with catwalks that smelled like summer pools. I chose the second because it was mine. I knew the catwalks. I knew the taste of chlorine in the mouth, that metallic tang that rides your tongue for an hour after. We made a quiet caravan. 2 buses with irregular horn checks to scatter not gather. 3 bicycles with the kids and light supplies. 4 on foot with poles to tap random noise and not rhythms. I drove the Corolla with Emma in the back and Raina in the front, the Ruger in the console and the shotgun between her knees like a sleeping dog. Mason stayed at the depot because he wanted to feel life happen around him until he could not, and I respected that, though it killed me. He gave me the last of his hard candy and a scrap of a joke to tell Emma later if I needed to stop her tears. It involved a screwdriver and a 3/4-inch BSP threaded nipple and was not funny. The water treatment plant catwalks were a place I loved when I first got hired. They were orderly. They had logic you could see and maintain. Now, we used them for something else. We brought the group across above the settling basins and over the chlorine contact chamber. The air was thick with that cleansing smell that had become a shield. We learned quickly that if we let the fans push the tainted air out too fast, the watchers at the fence would cluster and then disperse like minnows hitting a rock, but if we pulsed the fans, irregular, we could keep the smell strong enough to keep them from stepping forward without making a signal for more to join. I taught Shonda the panel pattern I made up for the fan controls. It was not elegant. It was effective. 30 seconds on, 12 off, 24 on, 5 off, and then nothing for 45, then a long pulse like a man's breath when he walks upstairs carrying a box of books. She wrote it down on her clipboard. She did not smile. She had stopped doing that thing. We set the kids on the higher catwalk with the green band kitchen crew, and we kept them out of line of sight of the fence. We brought the red band couple in last and put them by a fan and told them to sing wrong. They cried and sang and then cried again without rhythm. This felt like a victory. I want to tell you that we settled there and became a new species of orderly. The truth is that 3 days later, the big generators started to cough because diesel is not infinite when you trade it for water, and the city had taken to coming to the fence and asking with faces that turned the asking into a pattern as bad as any tapping. A group from the warehouse syndicate stopped by with the kind of offer men make when they were authority, like a coat they found in a dead man's closet. Work for us in exchange for bunk space. No kids on runs, they said, and they nodded at our green bands with the same respect I had for their inventory of meat hooks and clipboards. They wanted our chlorine knowledge. They wanted to police our quiet hours and our rules. They wanted to add their whistle codes to our fan pulse and make the plant into another depot with armbands and an economy. It might have even worked for a while. They had men with sawed-off shotguns and women with tattoos of barcodes that they let you think were jokes. Brandon and I argued in the shadow of the catwalk stairs where the echo made our words as thin as skin. He said the syndicate at least had a way to scare off marauders. I said marauders do not fear hand-lettered rules. They fear sickness and leaks and the kind of accidents we can design, and I am that kind of designer. He said I sounded like a man who loved pipes more than people. He was wrong in a way that hurt because a little of it was right. The phrase that had haunted the week found me again that night as I walked the catwalk, the soles of my boots finding the slight give of the metal panels. I could see the city from there, the roads I knew as a father who drove the routes that soothed his child to sleep, now empty in the way of a holiday nobody wanted. First signs of the zombie plague, the streets are too quiet, the headline my mind kept pasting across the sky in fresh font every day, and now it meant something else. It meant the quiet we had built for safety had starved us of certain signals, the cough of a generator, the sigh of a bus air brake, the chorus of the depot's wrong hymn, and in that quiet we were making patterns without knowing it because human bodies have patterns, heartbeats and footsteps and the way we touch and the way we talk to those we love. That was the cruel part. Survival needed us to be irregular while everything in us wanted to be rhythmic so we could reassure the people next to us that we were reliable. I breathed on purpose, off the beat, counting not in 4 but in prime numbers, and it made me dizzy, and I laughed because my body is stupid and noble and wants to live. In the morning we had to choose. The syndicate wanted us to fold into their warehouse. They would give us cots and a schedule and the illusion of a future. The depot crew wanted to stay with the fans and the chlorine because it felt like something you could measure. Raina wanted to leave both and go north to her cousin's farm where corn dryers roared, and maybe the roar would keep the watchers away, though noise is not the same as safety. Mason was too tired to vote, which is its own vote. Emma asked me if we could go home, and I told her home was now wherever the door swung inward easy and the stairs above it let you see who was coming before they could see you. We stood on the catwalk with the smell of chlorine like a memory of summer pools and the sky the color of a bruise that has decided to heal. The generator coughed again. The fuel can I had traded for the wrong kind of gasoline sat as a red reminder that yesterday's smart move becomes tomorrow's dead weight. I took stock out loud to stop my head from making patterns of worry. Food left, 6 cans of chili, 5 of beans, 2 of peaches, and a bag of rice that smelled like the warehouse where it had sat for a decade. Water, enough, for now, because we could make it. Ammo, 5.22 rounds in the magazine, 10 in a box in my pocket. A lie you tell yourself because .22 is a noise more than a stop unless you put it where it matters, and I had learned to do that only twice under pressure. Batteries, 16 AA, 8 AAA, 1 headlamp at half charge, and a promise to the batteries not to waste them on fear. Tape, 2 rolls. Zip ties, a handful, in different sizes, the little ones that break when you look at them and the big ones that give you time. Fuel, a thin bottom in the generator tank, and a syndicate deal dangled like a payday loan. People, 31, with 2 kids, a red band pen empty for now, a blue band roster tired, a green band kitchen fierce, and a group of yellow band med techs who had learned to love bleach the way a soldier loves a clean rifle. My knee, aching. My pride, intact and in the way. I thought about the big box store back corridors and how they had taught us to use rolling cages as gates and irregular sound as a net. I thought about the parking garage stairwell and its lyre echoes and how car alarms can cut the mind of a thing that follows patterns. I thought about the community garden and the sound curtains and the fan pulses and the way the water treatment plant has catwalks that make you see your life as a series of platforms you either cross or you fall from. I thought about the smell rule we had discovered by accident, how chlorine and ammonia can break the mind of a thing that wants to pattern, but how you cannot live in a cloud of poison and call it a life. Brandon waited with his blue band on his bicep and his fingers on a clipboard, not because he wanted to be a man of lists, but because someone had to be. Raina had the shotgun in a ready rest, the barrel pointed down, the safety on, the stock against her thigh, every instruction her father had ever given her made into muscle. Shonda had her whistle under her shirt and her eyes on the kids. The syndicate men waited beyond the fence, their guns low and their mouths smiling as if they were about to close a property deal. The watchers were scattered like punctuation across the road, commas and periods, every one of them ready to turn into an exclamation mark if we clapped the wrong way. First signs of the zombie plague. The streets are too quiet, I told myself again, and this time it meant a third thing. It meant we had to make some noise on purpose, the kind that lives without patterns, the kind that buys time without buying a bill we cannot pay tomorrow. It meant we could not be still, but we also could not march. I looked at my daughter, hair pulled into a knot I tied badly. She held the whistle she hated in the backpack she loved because it had a patch with a fox on it. She watched my face, ready to do what I said because she still thought I knew the shape of the path ahead. I made the decision that will either save her or be the moment I mark as the start of the loss I will not survive. I told Brandon we would try the north route tonight, to the old reservoir, across the highway over the jackknifed semi where the lanes are a frozen mouth, then toward the wind farm where the towers make their own irregular low throne, then out past the feed store where the smell of ammonium nitrate and spilled fertilizer might confuse a brain that follows the bland breath of a human. I told him we would do it with the depot crew only, no syndicate oversight, because the deal they offered felt like a cuff on the wrist that would become a hand on the throat later. I told him we'd take only what we could carry and not promise to come back if back became a place too loud to return to. I told Raina that she would lead and I would count, not steps, but sky changes, cloud shapes, the length of each inhalation of my child, anything to keep us off the beat. I told Shonda to bring the sound curtains and a bag of keys and to cut them into lengths we could hang from branches as we passed so the wind could be our musician. Brandon nodded. He did not smile. He made a mark on his clipboard that made no sound and broke no pattern and still felt like a bell. The syndicate men outside the fence shifted and I saw their weight go to their heels and I knew they would not let us walk without speaking. The generator coughed again like it wanted to add its vote. The wind changed and the chlorine smell went flat, and 3 watchers stepped forward as one, their tapping hands coming up with the certainty of metronomes. I put my hand on my daughter's shoulder and felt the small bones there, and for one heartbeat I wanted to say we would stay, that the depot's rules would last, that the plant's fans would never stutter, that the syndicate's guns would be for someone else, that the streets would fill with noise the way they used to, a bus brake sighing, a coffee shop door gonging, a man whistling 4 notes of a song he didn't know he remembered. I did not say that. I squeezed once. I said, "Shoes tied," and she nodded, and I told her to watch my left hand for when I squeezed twice, and that would mean we move, and when we move like a bad dancer on purpose. The syndicate man at the gate lifted his hand to talk. The watchers lifted their hands to tap. The generator inhaled and the sky went that color before rain. I had 4.22 rounds left in the magazine and 10 in my pocket, and the shotgun had 6 shells. We had 5 cans of beans and the sound curtains and the rule about smell. We had a road under a dead truck and a wind farm that might give us a hum to cover our breathing. We had my bad knee and my daughter's whistle and a little group of people who had learned in a week how to walk like ghosts without lying to themselves that ghosts are safe. I took a breath that did not fall into any count I'd learned in high school gym. I looked at Raina and Brandon and Shonda and then at the man with the clipboard who wanted to own our future, and I decided in the small moving place behind my heart that we would go now, not later, and we would go through the old community garden first to cut down every sound curtain we could carry so the wind could keep us company, and that we would not come back unless the river itself wrote us a letter that said the city remembered how to breathe. I raised my left hand. I squeezed twice.